Have you ever looked down at the zipper on your pants and noticed a little YKK written on it? Feel free to take a look now. I won't tell anyone that you're playing with your zipper. But what does YKK stand for, and what makes it so special? As you may have guessed, YKK is the company that manufactured the zipper, and there's a good chance that at least one coat, bag, or pair of jeans you own has their signature. YKK is currently the world's largest producer of zippers, owning something like 40% of the global market. They have factories all over, from India and Vietnam to New Zealand and Georgia. YKK doesn't just make zippers. They make zipper makers. They own copper mines. They own the forges that smelt the copper. They make buttons. They own the looms that spin their fabric. They own the fields that grow their cotton. They make windows. They make doors, which are basically just buttons for buildings. They make replacement parts for all of their machines. They even have a machine that automatically inserts a zipper into a pair of jeans. What don't they do? Surely this company is staffed exclusively by zipper-making wizards. It's amazing how through hard work and dedication, this humble Japanese button maker eventually came to dominate the global zipper market. I love an underdog story. This will be a super easy video. Oh, but wait a minute. When exactly were they founded? Oh, 1934? Central Tokyo? Oh. Oh, no. Now, in case you weren't aware, Japan was getting a little rowdy during the 1930s, so our story is actually going to begin way back with the Meiji Restoration. As you might imagine, there's a little bit more than meets the eye here, and unfortunately that means we have to go way back to get some of that precious context. But don't worry, I'll keep it brief, because the boxers don't come around until 1899. Our story begins with rice taxes, rural peasants facing starvation, merchants in competition with industrialized Western imports, samurai facing the end of their cultural relevance, renewed expectations for the emperor, the messy foundations of a new constitution, rapid upheaval of traditional life, and a desperate battle to prevent colonization. When Matthew Perry arrived in 1853 with his gunboats, nobody told the Japanese that life would be this way. Japan was put in a very scary situation right from the start. The Tokugawa isolationist period left Japan without the infrastructure for dealing with foreigners who wished to live and trade with the locals. The carpetbagging Westerners had difficulties integrating due to a language barrier, harsh restrictions on where they could live, and the prevailing Zaibatsu system of economics, which favored more protectionist firms. We'll be talking more about the Zaibatsu later. But for right now, we want to focus on those happy few who operated at the fringes of the system, those who would later be called Yokohama merchants. Work as a merchant or a salesman in Japan was looked down upon for a long time. During the Edo period, taxes were still collected in rice, so the lack of taxation for businesses outside of farming allowed non-taxable wealth to accumulate for some. In order to exploit this, the bakufu, or the military governors, would extend military opportunities to prominent families as a way of ensuring political support and guaranteeing mutually beneficial tax contributions. Merchants throughout the Edo period had to contend with the heavy regulations on the flow of goods. Oftentimes the cargo that was being transported had more legal protections than the human who was pulling the cart. Those who operated storefronts were often considered to be shady individuals who wished to exploit the humble working man, seeking profit more than contributing to his community. Raising capital to start a new business was virtually impossible since there was no banking infrastructure for private investment. If you wanted to start a business, you were going to need to borrow money from a family member or some friends. This allowed only a few very well-connected and very wealthy clans to support these gigantic interwoven chains of business known as Zaibatsu. These networks allowed for less profitable ventures to be financially covered by better performing ones since the family completely controlled the internal cash flow. Because of this, a Zaibatsu could offer a diverse set of products and services to cover a multitude of different markets. Poorly connected merchants just had a difficult time breaking into the market unless a new niche was discovered, and even then they would need the right capital. Diplomatically immune, but geographically isolated foreigners turned out to be the perfect fit for enterprising Japanese businessmen who had few connections under the existing Zaibatsu framework. The Japanese were rapidly becoming aware of the progress the West made during the Edo period. Their paranoia of colonization was the perfect fuel for the factories and forges. The textile industry is a perfect microcosm of how colonization pressure produced a rapid expansion of technological and economic growth. British-made clothing became extremely popular during the early Meiji period, freeing up domestic cotton for the production of goods fit for export. There were strong market incentives to produce intermediate goods in the Japanese economy because the state was sponsoring a campaign for import substitution. This versatility allowed Japan the opportunity to both export to and import from Western nations during their industrialization, while simultaneously establishing a presence in East Asian markets. Japan began to import cotton from India, spin it into usable fibers, pass it through a modified Western-style loom, cart it off to the local seamstress, and at the end have 3 completely different products all ready to enter both domestic and international markets. This process was facilitated when the entire cotton industry started collaborating with the Mitsubishi shipping empire, forming a mutually beneficial and protectionist relationship. Huh? What's that? Oh, this video is about zippers? Yeah, okay, that's cool. Just one sec. First I gotta talk about
military expansionism under the Western industrialist model.
So while Yokohama merchants began their small trading empires, Japanese diplomats went abroad to learn exactly how the late 1800s had been going for the rest of the world. Not very well, as it turns out. The diplomats studied hard and came away with 3 key lessons from the nations that had already industrialized. First and foremost, the most successful nations were the ones that controlled more land than the lines drawn on a map. Former Prime Minister Aritomo Tamagata put it most succinctly in 1890 by calling for the enforcement of 2 national lines: the line of sovereignty and the line of national interest. The English and French may have called this expanding the civilized world. The Americans might have described it as some destiny in need of manifestation. But in Japan, the slogan was Fukoku Kyohei, or enrich the country, expel the barbarians. They didn't really like Westerners that much. The second lesson was that foreign experts were willing to offer a wealth of knowledge in exchange for a wealth of gold. Since these were the nations that wrote the New World rule book, it might be a good idea to be friends with some of them. This process saw Japan strengthen its ties to the US not only as an important economic partner, but also as a sort of industrialized parental figure. You know, since it was the US who kinda got Japan involved in this whole world market system anyway. The third lesson was simply industrialize or get colonized. A strong economy that was viewed as oriental or infantile to the West was ripe for invasion and exploitation. Together, these 3 lessons taught Japan that in order to gain respect, one should consider carrying a big stick, regardless of whether or not they desired to speak softly. Part 2. Enrich the country, strengthen the military. So now that Japan had the rulebook and knew how to play the game, it was time they marched off the bench and onto the field. Their first foray into this twisted game was the expansion of national interests in both Korea and the Chinese borderland of Manchuria. These areas were under weak political control, subjected to conflicting warlords, and most critically, absolutely stuffed with natural resources. The first Japanese-Sino War in 1894 was just whetting their appetite. The real showstopper was Japan's success against Russia during the aptly named Russo-Japanese War a decade later. This was fought with excruciatingly restrictive budgetary concerns, nearly bankrupting Japan in just a single year of fighting. Military service was seen as highly honorable, invoking the image of the noble samurai, convenient for a nation that was starting to feel its lack of land and natural resources. Ever wonder how Japanese cotton was able to replace imported Indian cotton while not cutting into silk or rice production? Easy. You grow the cotton in Korea. It took a few years of shuffling around paperwork, but Korea was officially annexed in 1910. Literally 1 year later, the Republican Revolution of China shattered imperial control of Manchuria. Nationalist Japanese officers stationed in Korea were keenly aware of the wealth of natural resources just to their north and began to conspire to establish direct Japanese administration. It was right around this time that many former samurai began to reorganize and consolidate into secret societies, such as the Black Dragon and Dark Ocean societies. Meanwhile, in Europe, things were really starting to heat up with the onset of World War I. This war brought a profound economic boom to Japan since they were the only industrialized power not to be directly involved with the main theater of combat. Japan was able to ramp up its steel production, export textiles and cotton for an even higher price, and finally get around to establishing a chemical industry. The economy rapidly grew, and many small merchants became fabulously wealthy through nothing but luck and endless export demand. This period also saw a further expansion of a unique sort of banking strategy known as Kikan Ginko. Here's a summary of how it worked. Say we have a small village where the Franklin family has made and sold the best cheese in Japan for the past 150 years. One day, little Floyd Franklin decides that he wants to start a pancake business called Franklin's Pancakes and Bacon, but he doesn't have all the Franklin family money, just the Franklin family name. So Floyd Franklin gets bankin' and opens up Floyd Franklin's Dank Bankling, and since everyone in town knows about the Franklin family, they trust their money is in good hands there. Now since Floyd owns the bank, he decides which businesses to loan money to, and it just so happens that he wants to award every single loan to Floyd Franklin's Pancakes and Bacon, exclusive access to loans from his own personal bank. What this means is Floyd has successfully secured funding for his business through the magic of just his family name. Situations like this genuinely happened several hundred times during the Edo and Meiji periods. As you can imagine, this began to overload the banking system with bad debt and no way to repay customers in the event of a bank run, but for the most part, this was successfully swept under the rug. Let's hope it doesn't all come unraveled a few years later during a tragic natural disaster right after the death of a prime minister. This whole experience of an economic boom tied to a military campaign on foreign soil was really beginning to emerge as something of a pattern in Japan. It was a theory which the diplomats had developed on their mission in the late 1800s, and it was really starting to bear fruit. The Japanese economy would forever be marked by the success they saw in the turn of the 20th century, but following the end of the Great War, the good times turned into the uncertain times. Merchants who were successful with infinite demand weren't quite as fortunate when the European markets experienced a post-war boom of their own and the Japanese goods lost their export appeal. A period of semi-voluntary economic austerity was the Japanese counterpart to the America's Roaring Twenties, ushering in a decade of uncertainty from which the bloody empire would begin to rise. But first, every 1920s needs a Great Depression, and Japan was a little ahead of the game. They had theirs in 1923. A massive earthquake struck at noon on September 1st, 1923, right around when most people were starting to cook lunch. Soon most of Tokyo was in flames, and then soon after that, the entire Japanese banking system was also in flames. In an effort to help rebuild after the earthquake, the Central Bank of Japan used public tax revenue to stimulate infrastructure loans from smaller banks, many of which ended up being of the Kikan Ginko variety. Instead of taking the loans to help provide for infrastructure, these banks were able to settle their bad debt with public funds. By the end of the first round of intra-bank loans, Finance Minister Naohara Kataoka found himself with significantly more bad debt than the nation was prepared to handle, resulting in even more bank runs. A long-term goal of the mid-1920s banking reform was to consolidate small and unreliable banks into large, better-managed firms. After the 1927 banking crisis, there were only around 600 banks left operating in Japan, and none of them were the Kikan Ginko. Banks were now largely controlled by the big boys, like our old buddies Mitsubishi and Mitsui. This was great for the regular depositor, but really bad for small businesses who wanted to raise investment capital. Remember? We've already had this problem once before. Once again, just faintly in the background, barely out of view, the Zaibatsus are still there. Economic puppet masters who now control shipping, the banks, shipbuilding, and even railroads. Japan was very careful not to allow foreign ownership in their infrastructure, but at the same time was totally doubling down on protectionist oligarchies collaborating with the state. The expansion of heavy and chemical industries saw additional players entering the ring: Nissan, Nakajima, Furukawa Electric, Asanao Cement, and these are just a few of the new kids on the block. These well-funded, vertically integrated firms were indispensable utilities for the imperial ambitions of this blooming empire. Confidence in their domestic production guaranteed proper logistics for any future invasion, and the 1930s saw the start of the big one. Part 3. War Economy and the Collapse. And not zippers, I guess. Keen to get started on their most ambitious project yet, the Kwangtung Army stationed in Korea began formulating a false flag operation that would give justification for a full-scale invasion of Manchuria. They took 42 small yellow packages rigged to explode and then placed them in the general vicinity of the South Manchuria Railway. Now keep in mind, the plan wasn't actually to damage the tracks. In fact, reports claim that a train passed right by the incident undeterred just a few hours later. However, it was plenty big enough of an explosion for Japanese troops to rush into nearby villages and just start slaughtering people. Soon after, the commanding officer of the Kwangtung Army decided that the region would be much more stable if he was the one in control as a totally unelected representative of the emperor. A representative that had absolutely no authority to make this decision, mind you, but one who basically couldn't be stopped by the government back on the mainland. Western empires finally started to notice Little Japan taking after them and got all pissy about it. In 1932, the League of Nations began investigating diplomatic ways to punish Japan for their unauthorized Manchurian aggression with little luck.
Bad little copycat. Only we can do that to China.
The League's resolutions were so insulting that Japan withdrew from the organization entirely. Civilian government back at home realized that all control over the situation in China was now in the hands of the military. There was no diplomatic solution remaining to this colonial province. The most anyone could do about this colonial expansion was for domestic politicians to try and set the invasion in a positive light and encourage pan-Asiatic paradise, but specifically one for Japanese farmers who wanted to own their own land. What ended up happening was actually quite similar to the American Wild West, only with medical experimentation instead of cowboys and steel mills instead of ranches, but they definitely nailed the whole racial supremacy thing.
Oh god, where in the world are we? It looks so old-timey and depressing here, and this guy is still not talking about zippers!
Well, hi there, traveler. Looks like somebody's lost.
Well, yeah, I was just going out for a walk, and then this dude threw a bag over my head and started mumbling something about YKK, and... Wait, who are you?
Why, I'm the bonsai buddy.
That joke's in bad taste, and the bonsai pilots weren't even a widely established tactic until the Pacific Campaign.
Well, you sure seem to be a know-it-all smartass, aren't you? Don't you realize that this is the start of the Pacific Campaign? When Japan invaded Manchuria in 1931, they were at the center of an unbroken string of combat until 1945. The sun has risen and the harsh morning will spell destruction under the great boot of...
Anyway, like the monkey said, now that Japan invaded Manchuria, this conflict would eventually spiral into what would turn into World War II. This also means that pretty soon we can start talking about that little YKK on your zipper, but not yet. 'Cause right now they were just a small button shop. That's right, you've gotten over 10 minutes of what's basically just exposition. And guess what? There is still some more things I need to cover. Remember those secret societies of former samurai I mentioned earlier? You have been taking notes, haven't you? Groups like the Black Dragon Society and Dark Ocean Society grew increasingly more confident as the military gained more independence. The 1930s saw a massive rise in political violence and assassinations, the most significant of which was an attempted coup of February 26, 1936. On the surface, the violence of February 26 can easily be dismissed as an irrational scheme cooked up by extremists who had little chance of success. But consider what we know now. Mitsubishi had a well-funded, well-organized naval empire, which was the exclusive transportation of the military. Mitsui had weaved together Japan with railroads and owned the coal mines to power the trains. Even Kawasaki was contributing with the manufacturing of, defense equipment. The industrial relationships with the military contributed to the image of expelling Western interests from the Pan-Asian sphere entirely. The Zaibatsu had to protect their potential to expand into new markets while also being integrated into the military's logistics. By finally reaching import substitution and subjugating both Korea and Manchuria, even the most tame nationalists figured that they had everything set to install their Pan-Asian empire. And yet, they failed to seize control of the government despite a 3-day-long siege of Tokyo. Young Emperor Hirohito denounced the rebels and ordered them to stand down. He refused to become the dominating military figure that they so desired. He kinda changed his mind later, but it was mainly due to the influence of one Prime Minister Hideki Tojo. But when you get right down to it, the nationalists and the military were onto something. The Zaibatsu were firmly in support of the military, and the civilian government was still divided between the Constitution Party and the Friends of the Constitution Party. Now I'm going to do something you might not expect. I'm skipping entirely past World War II. Yes, a lot happened, and it's obviously a really important part of Japanese history, but I've already rambled at you for long enough. Other than a few odd pieces of legislation here and there, the economic situation of Japan only got more desperate as the war went on. By just jumping right to the end of the post-war economic occupation, we should be able to summarize what we need to as we continue. So forgive me, but it's no longer 1936, rather it's 1945. and Big Dick Douglas MacArthur has big dick plans for the economic future of Japan, namely a dissolution of the Zaibatsu system. Except, he couldn't do it. Part 4. Why did Dougie fail? Okay, so I suppose fail is a bit of a harsh word, but he certainly didn't dismantle the monopolistic enterprises as thoroughly as he wanted to. The main problem with trying to Marshall Plan Japan was a fundamental misunderstanding about what allowed their economy to prosper in the first place. You see, Dougie didn't have Chief Monrovia here to go way off the rails and down a rabbit hole while trying to explain a tangentially related topic. Pre-war Japan had successfully completed import substitution, something the Americans in charge didn't condone and couldn't profit off of. But the war left Japan's capacity for self-reliance greatly diminished, something the Americans in charge did condone and could certainly profit off of. The reintroduction of imports rubbed many Japanese the wrong way, as though they were finally going to be subjected to the economic vassalage they had feared since Commodore Perry. And don't forget, the war absolutely destroyed Japan. Like, we all know about the two big ones, but we often forget about the firebombing that was done before they were dropped. By the end of 1945, Japan was basically nothing but smoldering ruins, a vast wasteland of ash and homeless civilians who had nowhere to go. Rebuilding the economy meant literally rebuilding the entire nation of Japan. The original plan for the economic restructuring was the removal of the Zaibatsu system. Unfortunately for the Americans, this was not a successful strategy since there was nobody who could replace them. For the longest time before the bombs fell, Japan was fully dependent on these titans. This history went largely ignored by the occupying forces, but it couldn't be dismissed entirely. While the majority of post-war reforms went over relatively well in Japan, it was the economic recovery that confounded Dougie the most. Lucky for the Allies, the economy of Japan would recover quite rapidly with the assistance of Korea. Well, not the direct assistance of Korea, but rather from the world powers using Korea as a little war playground. This reopened local markets for Japanese goods, which was especially useful for redeveloping the essential industries like steel, ships, and chemicals. Japan was able to ride the wave of increased demand that the Korean War brought, just like so many other wars before it. After all, an armed and economically capable Japan would only be scary if they were communist. 5 years was long enough for some things to change, however. Primarily, the efforts to repair the Japanese banking system, the specifics of which I have no intentions of getting into. Rest assured, the most important result of the transitional period from 1945 to 1950 for the purposes of our story was the beta testing of a new system that would later be developed into the modern Keiretsu system. The Keiretsu system was functionally quite similar to how the old Zaibatsu system operated, but critically different was a dedicated bank incorporated into each business network. Modern-day Keiretsu are also large webs of interconnected businesses, and are usually controlled by just a small handful of powerful owners, but they now also get to control their very own bank as a source of exclusive funding. Remember the Franklin family? It's kinda like that, but much better regulated. Now that we've mentioned the Keiretsu system, it's time. Finally, we can start talking about YKK and how this post-war economic recovery brought an environment rich in opportunity for a child of the chaotic 30s. So let's play some quick catch-up with the company, shall we? Alrighty, 1934. Congrats! It's a boy! Let's name it Yoshida Kogyo Kabushiki Gaisha. They make buttons. I'm so proud of our little man. Uh-oh, it's 1942, and the Americans just dropped some spicy bombs full of war crimes, and now YKK is temporarily just an iron foundry. Tough luck. But soon they're back on their feet, making all sorts of fascinating fastening products like nuts, bolts, snaps, nails, and yes, even zippers. YKK was well aware of the strategies of larger joint stock companies and had determined that the most successful strategy for long-term growth was total self-reliance, also known as vertical integration. It's important to note that after the war, horizontal integration became widely popular in Japanese firms also, but vertical integration was way more successful prior to those mid-1940s banking reforms. 1955 was another big step for YKK. They decided to build their first fully integrated facility on the west coast of Japan. This expansion was, well, kinda boring. But then, in 1959, they did something actually kinda ballsy and opened a facility in New Zealand, the Japan of the Southern Hemisphere. This was pretty far outside of the established operating practices for Japanese corporations. Multinationals were still a pretty radical concept even for the West during the early 60s. The reason YKK's multinational attempt succeeded is the same reason that made it borderline insane. They wanted their employees to completely melt into the local culture of wherever they expanded. Yoshida himself meticulously selected staff that would be a good fit, since a promotion that sent an employee abroad was expected to be a permanent relocation. Let's take a look at the official YKK manga Volume 1 for more details about this story. Oh? Does your company not produce its own manga about important historical accomplishments? I thought you were serious about business. And ladies and gentlemen, turns out that was a dirty fucking lie, cause this video is already way too fucking long. So instead what I'm going to do is review the manga in its own separate video, because one video on YKK just wasn't enough for me. YKK was incredibly successful at their strategy of assimilation, since instead of viewing each new factory as just a money-generating asset, they chose to view them as an opportunity to practice private sector diplomacy. The historical precedent in Japan showed that companies that cooperated most closely with the government were the ones that lasted the longest in the market. Perhaps the greatest example of private sector diplomacy was the foundation of a massive, fully integrated facility in Macon, Georgia. America already had a zipper monopoly, Talon, the original inventors of the zipper. However, American monopolies are bush league compared to Japanese monopolies. Talon grew weak and decadent, and their empires were sure to crumble. YKK never stopped to rest on their laurels, going so far as to partner with Wrangler jeans. This partnership sealed, or rather, zipped, the fate of their American competitors. Wrangler liked YKK zippers, but didn't like running multiple machines to sew them into their jeans, so YKK invented the Zippernator 9000. Okay, that's not what they called it, but they did make a machine that automatically sews zippers right into the Wrangler jeans, silently revolutionizing the American fashion industry. Man, all this talk about zippers is tiring me out, even though most of this video has been about Japanese history. Let's watch some anime, huh? Ah, wait. Something seems off about this. Did they just shoot a zipper from their wrist? You don't think. Oh, that's right. You thought they stopped at manga? Absolutely not. Get ready for a 4-episode anime, baby. This kid has only one leg.
Ouch!
That's not something a zipper can fix. Anyway, we now know that YKK was a rapidly expanding multinational following the post-war economic miracle. So why did I choose to explain over 70 years of Japanese history instead of just making a short and boring video? Well, YKK was not remarkable for a majority of their history, nor did they really utilize any unprecedented business techniques. But that's exactly why their success needs to be discussed. Most of the practices that made YKK so successful were already common in Japan, but they were just ignored by the West. You see, vertical integration is generally considered to be a massively risky strategy. It's plenty difficult to operate a business that sells just one product, but when that same company is required to manufacture and quality control its own intermediate goods, small disruptions in procedure can become unstoppable collapses. YKK was far from the first Japanese joint stock company to mine and smelt their own metals. They did not pioneer the concept of weaving and dyeing their own textiles, but they were one of the few that was able to do this successfully after surviving 15 years during the most turbulent times of world history, with no Zaibatsu clan money backing them up. Vertical integration isn't the only key. Clever long-term strategy and partnership with authorities secured both land and opportunity for YKK. Sometimes, in order to be lucky, you need to have the skill set to take advantage of the opportunity offered to you, and in this way, YKK was incredibly lucky. Another contribution that is often overlooked is how YKK experimented with aluminum as a material for consumer goods. It's easy to forget in our modern age that aluminum used to be considered more precious than gold. Even when aluminum became more abundant during the turn of the century, many were still reluctant to use it for any practical purposes. YKK's utilization of the industrial potential of aluminum put them way ahead of the curve by exploiting an underutilized resource in their factories. All of these factors individually made YKK a successful company and a major player in the New World economic order, but that doesn't explain their command of the zipper market, Need I remind you that 57% of global trade for a specific product is completely outside of our human ability to conceptualize. I should also remind you that zippers aren't even the only thing that YKK makes. They make architectural products like doors and windows as well, and they still command this massive economic niche. So there must be something else, right? Something I'm leaving out? It's the military involvement. Okay, now in a second I'm going to go on and on about how it's the market appeal, and that's fine and I can prove that. But here is the thing that I really can't prove, but I still need to talk about. See, that's the one thing throughout this whole zipper-related research that I was looking for, but I wasn't officially able to find. Now, I'm choosing my words carefully because I can't definitively say that YKK is tied to any global operating armies. But based on the research I was able to do, it does seem like it is part of their business. There's a dedicated section on their website for military and police-related products. That's not difficult to find, but just because they sell it doesn't mean that they're a major government contractor like GE or Honeywell. Much like Japan operating a self-defense force with helicopter destroyers, or a blind birdwatcher with a pair of binoculars, we know that they have the right tools, but we're not exactly sure how they're about to use them. In saying this, however, I want to remind you that the company was founded in the middle of the most turbulent times in Japanese history, as if I haven't said the word turbulent enough. Yoshida was a deeply patriotic individual who ran a business that produced highly refined industrial goods. Despite no proof of this claim, I think it's fair to assume that the Imperial Army was purchasing some of his products. I'm sorry. It's hard to speak specifically on the historical precedent for the Imperial Army purchasing supplies from Yoshida, but the term total war isn't used all willy-nilly. It's the market appeal. High-profile use of their product, and not in the as-seen-on-TV kind of way, more like the zippers that helped man walk on the moon. In fact, YKK is still making the zippers that are sewn into spacesuits, most recently working with Boeing in 2017. They partnered with Gucci, Louis Vuitton, Wrangler, North Face, Jansport. Everybody wants to be partnered with a company that can proudly say they have full control over every single aspect of their product. So why is YKK the global head of zippers? Because they founded their company at the perfect time to take advantage of a hyper-aggressive military that hated Western competition and relied on domestic support. They were small enough to fly under the harsh economic reforms of Big Dick Dougie following the total destruction of Japan, and they were able to fully capitalize on every opportunity to vertically integrate and expertly manage their multinational facilities. I hope the next time that you're trying on a new jacket or a pair of pants, you glance down at the zipper and smile fondly, knowing that it was produced by a faceless, monopolistic company that has access to more money than God himself. That despite all of the virtues of a company that pays survivable wages to employees, we all feed into an endless cycle of production and consumption that makes some firms more wealthy than we can even begin to fathom. And that's just the way the world turns.